No, just kidding. I'm Todd Wilson. Welcome back to the Georgia Journal. This is part 2 of our trip to Cumberland Island National Seashore. And we are aboard the Cumberland Lady this time, one of the ferries operated by the National Park Service that takes visitors to and from Cumberland Island National Seashore. Now, in the first episode, we brought you glimpses of the south end of the island, some of the beach experience, the Dungeness ruins, and some other things. We'll be showing you a little bit of that, but a whole lot this time is focusing on the backcountry experience. And a new thing coming up by the Park Service offering folks tours to the backcountry via motor vehicles. So if you're not able to walk a whole long way, which it is 16 miles one way, it gives you a chance to see some of the sights. But that's what we're going to be bringing you this week on Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal. It's our second part of our visit to Cumberland Island. We've got a half hour, and that's still not enough to bring you everything that you can see here on this beautiful barrier island, the southernmost off the coast of Georgia. Let's get started. In our first episode on Cumberland Island National Seashore, we gave you a brief history about the human footprints found here. There are traces of these periods that are displayed at the Ice House Museum and those that can be seen across the island. The growth of man's permanent presence on Cumberland began with the explorers, on to the post-Revolutionary War period, then to the plantation era, and peaked during the Industrial Revolution. In part 2, we'll be joined by interpretive ranger and volunteer coordinator Maggie Tyler, who'll be showing us even more about the people who once called the island their home, starting with the plantation era. And the largest plantation at one time on Cumberland, which was during the era when Sea Island cotton, grown and picked by slave laborers, was owned by Robert Stafford.
We're standing in the remains of the Stafford plantation field. This was a portion of Robert Stafford's plantation, which was worked by 400 enslaved African and African Americans. And here he grew long staple cotton.
Is that also known as Sea Island cotton?
It is Sea Island cotton, and was valued because of the long staples, which meant the long fibers of the cotton made it very valuable on the open market.
Stafford was born on the south end of Cumberland in 1790, and after being sent away in his youth for school in Connecticut, returned to Cumberland. In 1813, his two sisters and mother would make their first large land purchase, some 600 acres at a cost of $3,000. It would eventually expand into the Stafford plantation. He initially planted rice and used slave labor to work the fields. By what some deemed as questionable or even ruthless money-lending practices, Stafford would expand his holdings to 8,000 acres by the 1840s. And by 1850, he owned most of the island and some 500 slaves to work the land. Stafford, who never married, though, did father 5 children with a mulatto slave named Zabet. Cotton, of course, was king, and Stafford's wealth grew. Cotton, though, would not be the first main crop exploited from Cumberland. Indigo was grown there in the 16th century, and the live oaks were harvested then for ships.
Well, we had a little bit of sassafras and indigo, but actually the first crop on Cumberland was actually live oak wood, which was a wood valued for building ships like the USS Constitution.
In fact, the clearing of land on the island was so great, by the mid-19th century, the ocean and intercoastal waterway were both visible from the middle of the island. Stafford would stay there through the Civil War, and rumor has it that he might have burned down the cabins of his former slaves following the war, although archaeological studies around the chimneys suggest that the cabins were actually torn down rather than burned. Stafford would die in 1877 at the ripe old age of 87. His plantation home would eventually burn, and a new Stafford house would be built during the Carnegie years.
We're now standing here at the cemetery for Robert Stafford, his mom, and his wife. The tabby walls were original walls constructed for the Stafford family cemetery. Now, later in life, after the Staffords had left the Cumberland Island area, the Carnegie family came in, as we all know, and the Stafford Place house, which is further up the road, was occupied by one of the Carnegie family members. They were very interested in golf and actually used some of the Stafford plantation to build golf links. And so you'll notice that when you look at the cemetery, there's a much larger grave marker here in the front, and that's for Thomas Hutchinson. And he was a golf pro who came from St. Andrews, Scotland to design the Cumberland Links. It was a 9-hole golf course, and by all accounts was very challenging. Amongst many of the recreational pursuits that the Carnegie family members followed, not only golf, but polo, horseback riding, hunting, and all we know is that he was involved in some kind of horse accident, fell off a horse, and died shortly thereafter.
Reconstruction and the Industrial Revolution brought the settlement to the north end of Cumberland. Free men, former slaves, were given property under the government plan called Sherman's Reserve. These portions of property which were once tended by slaves would be given over to them as their own. We'll be visiting the settlement on Cumberland's north end when Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal returns. Welcome back to Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal as we take you to the north end of Cumberland Island. The settlement would begin as rustic cabins near the area of Cumberland known as High Point. Former Stafford plantation slaves or freemen and their families would live in their own community, and in 1893, the first African Baptist Church would be founded by Reverend T. Lockett, Deacons W.M. Alberty, C. Trimmings, and Primus Mitchell. Part of the north end and the old settlement here on Cumberland Island, a lot of people wonder, Bobby Kennedy Jr., John F. Kennedy Jr., where did he get married? Well, this is the church, but it's a lot more than that. It's the second incarnation of the first African Baptist Church.
That's correct. The story of the Baptist Church here is really a complex story, and it really relates to the importance of the church in the settlement for freed blacks here on Cumberland Island. Going all the way back to the 1870s and 80s, there were 2 freed colonies for blacks here on Cumberland Island, and they developed as working, living communities, and of course they built a church. And so further down by Cumberland Wharf, that was where we believe the first church, and they built that church in the 1890s. And then later in time, as the settlement grew and developed as a place for people who worked at the High Point Hotel, they moved the church here to where we see it. And what you see now was actually built in the 1930s.
So it was a lot more than just a celebrity wedding. It was a place for worship, for weddings of many people, and, well, funerals too. Primus Mitchell was actually born into slavery and said witnessed the burial of General Light Horse Henry Lee as a boy. He would spend his life almost 100 years on Cumberland, dying there in 1910.
Primus Mitchell was actually a slave of Robert Stafford's. He shows up in the records as Prime Mitchell, and lived his entire life on Cumberland Island, both as an enslaved African American and then later in life as a freed black man. And it's a great story, and just goes to show you that one of the great human stories that we have here on Cumberland Island.
Probably the best known of the structures of the settlement, the First African Baptist Church is much more than just the site of the John Kennedy Jr. wedding. It represents a faith which endured slavery and blossomed during Reconstruction and still stands now. Other residents made their mark on the settlement as well through the years. One would travel globally and would even eventually become friends with a U.S. president.
So the red house that you see behind me is the remains of Bobby Richard's house. Bobby's just one of the folks that lived up here at the settlement later in life. And Bobby was a porter for Air France and was great, very fun character. And he and his wife brought an element of class to the settlement. And Bobby was also friends with President Carter. And President Carter would come and hang out with Bobby. They'd have shrimp boils, and President Carter had a very warm fondness in his heart for Bobby. And
in our first installment on Cumberland, we showed you the remains of the Carnegie family's first mansion, Dungeness. It was the first of many dwellings built by Lucy Carnegie for herself and her children. Their homes were built across the Carnegies' property all over the island. Over 200 servants alone worked between Dungeness and Plum Orchard. Most of the food was either grown or gathered from the island. The Carnegies even had herds of cattle they kept for milk and beef. Ranger Tyler explains how they protected the cows from the insects.
These were the dip tanks that they would use for cattle management during the Carnegie period. And the Carnegies had cattle for both for meat production and for dairy production. And so we find these structures all over the island. And so now we have to figure out how we're going to manage them as well. But when the Park Service actually took over, the cows still roamed the island. So we had feral cows, feral horses, feral hogs, and little by little we've had to figure out how to manage each of those animals.
From the former Stafford property, Grand Avenue continues through the forest, and then carved out of the wilderness, you'll find the Plum Orchard Mansion. That people have been here for thousands of years over the course of history. Well, here's one landmark that we're going to be taking a look inside with Maggie Tyler. Now, this is the Plum Orchard Mansion.
That's right. Plum Orchard was built in 1898. It was a wedding present for George and Margaret Carnegie. It's 22,000 square feet. It's a Georgian revival house, and it's our crown jewel here at Cumberland Island National Seashore.
Yeah, it's almost like the White House here as you come out of the roadway heading north, and you're in wilderness, and there's palmettos and there's the live oaks and all the different vegetation, and then all of a sudden here's this beautiful structure.
Exactly, and we do think a little bit of it as our White House, but it was the gift of Plum Orchard and 16 acres from the family of Dr. Marius Johnston and Nancy that started Cumberland Island National Seashore in 1972, and we are thankful for that.
Well, it's almost 30 years ago, and it's a treat that every couple of weekends folks get a chance to come up and tour on, I believe, the second and fourth Sundays at this point.
That's correct. They can catch the ferry from Sea Camp and take a nice little ride up the Brick Hill River and spend about an hour and a half with us touring the house.
Now, I know, though, that the Park Service is adding some motorized tours here in the very near future.
Correct. By the end of summer, we will start our Land and Legacies tour, and that'll happen daily. And people can hop on board one of our tour vans for an extra charge and spend the day with one of our Park Service employees, and they'll get to see Plum Orchard. They'll get to see Robert Stafford's plantation. They'll get to see Cumberland Wharf and a few special spots in between.
And there's a lot of history that they'll encompass on that exquisite tour. But right now, we're going to take you inside and show you what Plum Orchard Mansion is all about. Hey, welcome back. Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal, Part 2. Our visit to Cumberland Island National Seashore. Sure glad you're with us. Had some good comments about our first installment. Well, this time we're more on the north end of the island, midpoint northward, and we're visiting with Maggie Tyler. And Maggie has been kind enough to show us around some of the sites on the north end and parts of the island that not everybody gets to see. And we're fortunately inside taking a peek today at the Plum Orchard Mansion. Maggie, incredible chandeliers, incredible craftsmanship. Talk about this place.
Well, you mentioned the chandelier, and it's one of our pride and joys. It's one of actually 3 chandeliers in the house that are Tiffany original chandeliers. We found those in the attic when the Park Service started doing the restoration a few years ago. We put about $6 million into the restoration, including wallpaper, floors, exterior paint, the whole 9 yards to really spiff up the house.
And I know, fortunately, folks who may have seen Dungeness, the ruins in the first episode, before it got destroyed, some of those beautiful furnishings actually got to make it to here.
That's right. In 1916, when Miss Lucy Carnegie passed away, the family started to mothball Dungeness. They really didn't know what to do with that huge house, and so they started to spread around some of the furniture and paintings and things like that. We don't have the paintings here at Plum Orchard, but we do have some of the furnishings, like this huge table, the blanket chest on the far wall over there, and the sitting stool behind me to my side there.
Okay, now the Plum Orchard estate was built by Lucy for one of her children.
That's correct. It was a small thing of a wedding gift for her son George. The first part of the house was about $10,000. Plum Orchard today, as you know it and see it, is 22,000 square feet and was actually built in 3 stages. So when George married his wife Margaret, they had $10,000 to build a small seasonal cottage.
Seasonal cottage, and it's huge. And the number of rooms again and bathrooms.
106 rooms, 11 bathrooms, all complete with running water, flush toilets, steam heated towel racks. One of the bathrooms even has a bidet in it. All advanced modern technology for the turn of the century when Plum Orchard was built, starting in 1898. It was finished in 1906, and gorgeous Georgian Revival mansion.
Inside the main entrance, you'll find preserved some of the furnishings from Dungeness and exquisite woodwork.
Do the stenciling on the ceilings or to hang the wood. The wood was designed by a firm in Boston and then imported here for installation into Plum Orchard.
Next room in the tour is the library, which at one time held hundreds of volumes of books. This room, too, shows the detailed work done by craftsmen and laborers over a century ago.
So now we're standing in the library. This is one of the original rooms to the house, and during the original 1898 construction, it was actually 2 rooms. So there would have actually been a wall right here behind me. And the first part, front part, would have been the library. Second part would have been the gun room. 2 pursuits very important to the Carnegie family: libraries for knowledge, guns for the pursuit of hunting and recreation here on the island. When they expanded the house later in time, they actually decided to expand the library. And the great wallpaper that you see is actually potentially a Tiffany wallpaper. It's known as a water lily print. And one of the great things that was done when the wallpaper was installed is the installer actually followed that print all the way up to the top of the ceiling. So as you follow it up, they actually cut out the top leaves and flowers so that they go all the way up, and then left a barrier of blue sky, so it looks like the water lilies are going all the way up to the sky. So nothing is truncated. Again, emphasizing the craftsmanship that goes into creating Plum Orchard.